All right, hey everyone. This is Farmer Rishi, and I'm going to be doing this small space composting webinar with you all today. Just to introduce myself, I recently started working with Kiss the Ground. I am a urban farmer. I've been running a kind of a variety of different urban farms for the past 8 or 9 years, including a garden at my parents' home, which you can learn more about online. It's called The Growing Home. Now I'm working with Kiss the Ground to develop a regeneration in practice course where I'll be showing people how to put the ideas, the culture of regeneration in practice in your own home, whether you are living in an apartment or a home with a yard or in the city. I want to show you all the techniques to putting regeneration into practice. And what regeneration is all about it's all about healing, and it's about reframing our view of the world. And one of the most important reframings we can do is composting, because composting is where we're taking something that we used to see as waste. And in regeneration, really there is no waste. It's not zero waste, we're removing the word waste from our vocabulary. And what we're doing is we're seeing that what was once waste is actually a resource. It is a gift, and we're figuring out how to use that gift. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I do want to mention we're going to have that regeneration in practice course coming up. It's going to be starting in the middle of June. And also, this is a free webinar today, so there's a lot of you joining us. But normally these are for Kiss the Ground members, and you can sign up for a Kiss the Ground membership on the website. And then you'll be able to access these monthly webinars. Okay, so now let's get started and let's start talking about composting. So if you're in a small space, you're not going to be making a hot compost pile. We're here on my balcony or my patio garden, and I'm not going to be like collecting leaves and wood chips and food waste and piling it. I don't have a pitchfork out here. Like, it's not going to work in a patio environment or a balcony environment. So instead, today we're mostly going to be talking about the actual process of composting. We're going to be using vermicomposting, which is composting with worms. And I have some worms to show you right here. All right, we'll be talking more about those guys. And I have my worm bin right behind me here. But we're also going to be talking about collecting your food waste and what you can do. And I'm going to correct myself. I don't use the term food waste, actually. Food scraps or leftovers. That's a nice term for it. So how are you going to collect your leftovers? Which ones of those you can compost in a worm bin with worms, and which one of those you'll need to find another place to compost? Okay, so to start with, you got to know about the different types of food scraps that you're producing. Worms are really good at eating certain things. Mostly they really like to eat fruit waste, fruit scraps, vegetable scraps. They are good with grains, if your bread and your quinoa and whatever other ancient grains you might be eating. So they're able to eat all of those. They're really not good with eating meat, dairy, oily foods. So even cooked foods are not the easiest thing for them to digest. Citrus is really bad for them. Citrus can actually kill them very quickly. Super acidic foods like pineapple. I had a random one. I got some jackfruit from an Asian grocery store and put the leftovers of the jackfruit in there. Killed my entire bin. So certain things you really want to be very careful with. The jackfruit one was just kind of a random one that I encountered. But you're very safe with your, most of your vegetable scraps, your fruit scraps, your grain scraps. And when you're starting out your bin, you want to use those primarily uncooked. Okay, so just before you cook, or if you have a leftover salad, those things are all fine. What I do with the cooked food scraps, or the leftover food that's not going to be eaten by us, is I actually store it in a container in the freezer. And I have other gardens, so I take that frozen food waste to other gardens and I compost it over there. If you probably don't, maybe you don't have that available to you, but look around, and there's actually a lot of cool community organizations popping up all over. We have one here called LA Compost, and they actually have little drop-off centers all over the county, and you can drop off your food scraps there. There's also a municipal composting program starting. So if your city actually might be picking up food waste, that's a little bit more rare. And then, of course, if you just have a friend that has a garden and is already composting, and you can drop off your food scraps to that friend of yours, that's another great option. Okay, so let me get started and talking about the worm bin. And I'll just move this down a little bit. Okay, so you can see my worm bin right here. This is what we call a vertical migrating worm bin. This is one that I made, and I actually have a video of how to make this on YouTube. It's on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Farmer Rishi. We're going to be doing some more information like that for the Kiss the Ground as well. And you can make one like this. You can also purchase one. There's one that I recommend called the Worm Factory 360. And basically what happens with this worm bin is you fill it up with your food scraps, and you have to add the worms. Okay, so these worms, let me show you again right here. These are called red wiggler worms. It's a specific type of worm. Don't just go into your friend's garden and dig up some random worms. They are not going to be the ones that you need. You can find these at bait and tackle shops. You can find them in a lot of gardening stores, nurseries. They sell these red wigglers. You can also just ask around, if you have friends that garden. These red worms are pretty popular among gardeners. So you don't need that many of them to start a bin, but you need quite a bit of them to eat as much food scraps as you're putting out. So I only got a little bit to start this is a new bin I've just started, and I got about a handful of worms to start with, which means that each day that handful of worms can only eat about half a handful of worms of food scraps. So when we're starting out a bin, they're really not eating very quickly, right? So we're waiting for that worm population to really build up. And the more worms we have, the more food scraps our worm composting system will be able to handle. So in the beginning, you really got to start small. I'm not feeding them a lot. I'm not feeding them every day. I'm just feeding them enough so that they're able to process that amount of food scraps. And then as they, the longer they're in there, the more eggs they'll lay. They're actually, you can see them mating, and you'll find little egg sacs in there, and their population will really build up. And then once their population has built up, you can really start feeding them a lot more. So start off really slow. It's very important to start slow. If you just dump a bunch of food scraps in there when you don't have enough worms, you'll probably get a lot of other bugs in there, a lot of flies. There will be flies, I guarantee that, but don't worry about them. They're also part of the decomposition process. So just a little bit to start with. As the population builds up, keep feeding more and more and more. In the meantime, if you really want to get your food scraps in compost, utilize the other method, freeze some of your food waste, take it to a friend's house or take it to a local composting facility. So what I do is I just have a bowl on my counter, kitchen counter. I collect my food scraps in there. And, so today I have some eggshells, I have some tea leaves, some apples, some sweet potato. These are all perfectly good to go into the worm bin. I also did something very special for you guys for this webinar. I had to trim my beard after a long time, and so I'm even going to put my beard trimmings in here, all right? So remember, anything, well, don't put anything in there, but there's a lot of stuff that you don't think about that can go into into compost. And worms are actually perfectly fine with hair. And, I trim my beard over this piece of paper so I'm not wasting water in the sink. And I'm just gonna toss that in there. All right, so when you're starting off a bin, you wanna shred up a bunch of newspaper and throw it in there. They need some carbonous, some brown material to form their they call it bedding. It's basically their sleeping grounds. Like you need some beginning easy material that they like to hang out in. And then you're gonna be putting in the food waste. So I even have a tree that's above our balcony, and it sheds a lot of leaves onto here. So I sweep those up, and that's what I use for my bedding actually. You can use newspaper, you can use dried leaves, you can use, some people use coconut coir, which is something you'd have to buy, but there's a lot of free material that you can find around that you can use for this. So you just kind of spread it in, and then when you add your food waste, again, you're adding a little bit at a time. So today, actually, my worms look like they don't need that much more food. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of this tea leaves and throw it in there. And the way this works, again, they're just gonna eat that up. When they fill up these trays in these vertical migrating systems, you're gonna add food waste into one tray as that fills up. Then you'll go ahead and add another tray. Now this is just my system. It'll be different in, if you buy a bin or if you make your own. So now I'm just gonna add this one on top. And then I would start, I'll put my lid back. And then I would start adding more food scraps into that. And as I'm adding on the top, the worms are gonna travel up to find the new food. And then once that fills up, I'll add the next tray. And by the time we get up to the third tray, then they should have all left this bottom tray. And what I'll be left with is just pure worm castings, which is what we call the worm compost. And that I can just slide that tray out, and I'll have all this beautiful rich compost and use it for my potted plants. I could use it for my indoor plants. Some people, if you're in an indoor environment where you don't have a patio, you can definitely use the worm castings for your indoor plants. But if you have just too much, then put it up online and say, hey, I got all these free worm castings. Any gardener will be happy to come and pick it up from you. Maybe you can even sell it. Who knows? So I think that's yeah. Let me move on to go ahead and you can ask any questions on the chat there, and I'll be happy to answer them. So we got a question from Chad here, and he says, what about citrus peels? Yeah, so this is a great question. Anything that the worms can't eat, we have to find another place for them to eat it, right? So for me, what I do is I put the citrus peels into my container in the freezer, and then I would take it over to one of those, another composting place outside of my patio. So it's important to realize, like, you're not going to be able, if you're in a really small space, maybe you're not going to be able to compost everything. We're in a built environment that hasn't really been set up for us to do this. So don't feel bad. It's like sometimes, some of our food scraps may end up in the trash. Don't worry about it. We're working on it. It's a step-by-step thing, and you're not going to get all the way at once. Okay, then we got another question. Are coffee grounds okay for worms? Yes, absolutely. Coffee grounds are okay for worms. No problems with those. And we got another one. How about straw? Okay, straw. Yeah. Okay, straw from like rice straw or wheat straw or something. Yeah, absolutely. That's totally fine. A lot of questions coming in here. Temperature, yes. So we're here in LA, and the temperature is pretty even for them. But if you're in a colder environment, then you'll definitely need some kind of insulated place for them. So if you're keeping them indoors, no problem, right? Because the temperature that they live at is the temperature that we like to live at. So if you're keeping them indoors, that's not a problem. Some people in colder climates will keep them in a garage or some other protected place. If you're in a really hot environment, actually like LA here, it gets really, really hot in the summer now, and the bin can dry out. So in that situation, having a little bit of shade can actually be great. Or you'll have to come out and moisten the bin down. So just get a spray bottle and spray some water when you add the food waste, or whenever you're checking on it, just spray it, make sure it's nice and moist. Yes, we just had a question about, do we need to add water? Yeah, so you just want to keep it moist. You don't want it to be overly wet. You shouldn't see water like dripping down. Just moist is what you want. Straw bale. So yeah, you can use a straw bale. You would want to break that down and kind of break it up. It's not something that they're going to eat a lot of. Worms are actually much better at eating our food scraps, things that are more high in nitrogen than super carbonous material. But straw can be a good bedding material. All right, do you recommend we look for a certain type of compost system in particular, or just try and make one? So if you're indoors, I highly recommend you purchase one. If you're going to be composting indoors in an apartment or a condo, get a purchased one, because they will contain all the liquid and make sure nothing spills out. If you're making one on your own, then like this one, perfect for an outdoor space. But I wouldn't try to use this indoors. And like I said, the one that I've seen, the manufactured one I've seen that I recommend is called the Worm Factory. And if you're making a vermicompost with a plastic bin and newspaper shreds, do you have any particular recommendations so that the wigglers will thrive? Yeah, basically you want to make sure that the key thing really is to not overfeed them in the beginning. Don't just dump a bunch of food scraps on them. Like, start with a little bit. When you see that they've eaten that mostly up, then add a little bit more. When that gets eaten up, then add a little bit more. There's some foods that they really like to eat. Things that are small, broken down, like soft. So like tea leaves are a really good one. They eat tea leaves really well. Coffee grounds are also another good one. Just fruit, soft fruits are really easy for them to digest. So you could have, if you have a lot of apple scraps, or if you have even melon, is something easy for them to digest. All right, then the next one, do you boil your eggshells? Yeah, so that's something I've seen people do online. And I guess what I'll say about that is, some people take this more seriously than others. Like some people who are really into keeping their worms as happy as possible. They treat them like pets, you know, so they'll actually like chop up all the food scraps really finely so that it's like very easy and like perfect for them to digest. You can do that. That's the same with the eggshells. Like they'll eat they'll slowly eat the eggshells, you know, if you just put them in whole. Um, if you want them to eat it quicker, yeah, you can wash it. Some people even blend the eggshells into a powder. It's really up to you. It doesn't affect them too much whether you wash them or not. It's really just about how quickly they break it down. All right, especially if indoors, how to avoid odors. All right, that's a very good question as well. So remember, the one key thing to know about odors is you're going to get odors when you don't have oxygen. Odors are the result of anaerobic bacteria, and anaerobic bacteria only come around when there's a lack of oxygen. So the way to introduce oxygen into your worm bin is to use carbon materials. So actually, like these dried leaves that I'm collecting here, these are really nice. They're soft and fluffy. Fluff is really the key. They're small and fluffy, and that fluff will introduce air, and that air is what's going to keep the bacteria from turning to anaerobic bacteria, and that'll actually help the worms break the food waste down faster if you have more aerobic bacteria. So introduce some, you know, if you're doing it indoors, maybe you don't have access to leaves, so shredded newspaper is good. Maybe you want to buy some of the coconut fiber. That's an easy one for you to use indoors, not messy at all. Comes in little bricks that you can get at a nursery. All right, next question. What's the time frame for fresh food scraps to worm castings in a small home bin? Okay, that's a really good question. This bin, it looks pretty small, but actually once, you know, your food scraps are mostly a lot of water and air. So once the worms eat them up, they actually break down to a really small amount of compost, you know, so this much food scraps might turn into this much compost. So it really takes quite a while for this one tray to even fill up. And then, you know, I'm not harvesting this tray until the second tray is full and I'm on to my third tray. So it'll actually be about 2-3 months before I even harvest this bottom tray. And so it's not so much about, you know, how quickly do they eat it. It's really in your system how long till you harvest the castings. And it'll depend, of course, on temperature. It'll depend on what you're feeding them. It'll depend on moisture. So there's a lot of factors at play, but you know you can expect it's going to be like 2-3 months. And the next question is, are all types of leaves okay? Okay, that's a really general question. I'm always afraid to say all types of things are okay. There's definitely a chance that some type of leaf, you know, that you have in your yard, there's people joining this conference from all over the world. I'm sure there's some leaves of some trees that are toxic to worms. So I guess in that case, you know, if you're introducing something unfamiliar, look it up online or try feeding it a little bit at a time first. Generally, I would say dried leaves are perfectly fine, but you know, there's certain trees that have a lot of oils in them, which can be antimicrobial or you know, just might have something toxic in them. So if you're using leaves from a tree, don't use it. Maybe be cautious if you're using them from a tree that is known to have some kind of strong, like essential oils in it or something like that. Is there a concern about an indoor worm bin attracting pests like mice? That's a good question. Because the indoor worm bins, the manufactured ones, are made in a way where they're kind of sealed, I don't imagine that mice would be coming into those. And also, we're not feeding, you know, meat or cheese into the bin, so those kind of things are much more attractive to mice than, tea leaves and coffee grounds and vegetable waste. So I don't think you're going to have a problem with that. What about pine needles? Yeah, I've used pine needles. As long as they're nice, actually I have some right here. As long as they're dried up, if they're fresh, they might have a lot of essential oils in them. So once they're dried up, you can't smell anything in them, it's fine. And the next question, at what points are you giving your plants too much compost? Is there an ideal compost to soil ratio? Oh, very good question. Yeah, so there is such a thing as too much compost. Just as an example, I had recommended to someone to have a compost delivered to their garden because they were starting a new garden, and the lady laid down about 4 or 5 inches of compost, but then her plant started dying. And what happened was, it wasn't that the compost was killing them, but she had not changed her watering schedule, and the compost was absorbing all of the water that used to evaporate or run off, and that became anaerobic and caused her plants to start dying. So it's maybe that doesn't totally answer the question, but yeah, there is such a thing. There can be such a thing as too much compost. You don't want to plant your plants directly into straight compost. Compost has a really high water holding capacity, and a lot of times that means that it can hold too much water and not drain not drain well. So usually when we're using compost, we're mixing it in with something else. If you're making your own potting soil, for example, a common ingredient list would be 1 part compost, 1 part coconut fiber, 1 part soil from a garden, if you can get that, or 1 part perlite, which is like the white rocky stuff for drainage. In general, if you add 1/2 inch of compost to a potted plant, or 1/2 inch of compost to a plant in the ground, even 1 inch or 2 inches of compost to a plant in the ground, no problem at all. And if you're just starting off, I don't think you're going to be making all this compost, and that will ever be too much of a problem. But yeah, it's more about like how, if you just dump 2 feet of compost on something, you're going to cause a problem. But if over 10 years you added 2 feet of compost to a soil, you'll be fine. That will actually be great. Okay. All right, I think we're done with the questions here. So again, if you want to see more of these webinars, we do them every month. You're going to go to kisstheground.com and sign up to become a Kiss the Ground member. You can also, on the website there, kisstheground.com, join our mailing list. We're going to be sending out information about the upcoming Regeneration in Practice course through there. Like I said before, it is scheduled to start in mid-June. We're still finalizing a date. And feel free to email us with any questions. It's a good email. Okay, good email address is just info@kisstheground.com. All right, and see you again soon. Have fun with your composting adventures. Thank you.